Thank you for taking the time to judge proficiency awards at the section, district, and state level. I'm going to take a few minutes to highlight the rubrics that have been developed to ensure consistency amongst all records and all SAE projects. To find the materials you'll be using, you'll go to the IllinoisFFA.org website, hover over Downloads, click on General Downloads, scroll to the bottom of the page for the Proficiency Materials folder. The folder is titled 2017 Proficiency Materials. Click on that folder, and it will open up the proficiency materials that we will be looking at here today. A few things that we would like to point out about utilizing the rubrics: they must be used to ensure consistency between all students competing against one another, all judges who are judging these students, and at all levels. So as we advance from section to district to state, rubrics will be used, the same rubrics will be used at all levels. The first thing I'd like to point out is the score sheet side of the rubric. I hope to do so quickly and understand that this score sheet works the same for entrepreneur, agri-science, and placement. On the entrepreneur score sheet, a couple things that I would like to point out. You do need to put in the section or district number, the student's name, the student's school, their number of years they have within the SAE, their total hours within the SAE, as well as their earnings. In the entrepreneur score sheet, the ability to keep records, jobs and responsibilities, scope and growth, managerial responsibilities, skills learned, and the interview, all those scores are the same between entrepreneur and placement. In agri-science, there is a minor difference where accomplishments and findings is worth 15 points instead of 10, and managerial responsibilities is worth 15 points instead of 20. That is the biggest difference between agri-science, placement, and entrepreneur. The other difference is in entrepreneur, we call it scope and growth, is worth 10 points, and in placement, it's called hours and earnings, and that is worth 10 points. But if we are just looking at the other areas, I want to point out a few things. The ability to keep records is worth 20 points on all proficiency areas, and all easy record pages should be looked at, and all AET pages should be looked at. One of the things to also point out is that there should be no advantage or disadvantage from using paper books, easy records, or AET books. All books, while they look very different, should be judged and scored equally. So please take in mind to look at all pages in paper books, easy records, or AET. Again, we know they look different, but score them equally. Try to do so by using the rubric. Under jobs and responsibilities, it will tell you to find those in easy records on pages 4 and 5. In AET, it's under the description of the journal experiences. In hours and earnings, in easy records, again, found on pages 4 and 5. In AET, found in the description of journal experiences. Managerial responsibilities worth 20 points, pages 5 and 7 in easy records. AET, the description of journal experiences. Skills learned. In easy records or paper books, what we call the white pages or the core pages, page 8. In AET, found in the learning objectives. The interview is worth 20 points. Using the back side of the rubric, you can then begin to figure out how many points an interview should earn. I'm looking at the placement back side of the rubric, and while I know this may seem daunting because there are a lot of words and a lot of information, this is the information that we wanted to highlight to you in this webinar and give you the opportunity to see the items that we are talking about. I have a highlighted sheet that will kind of hit the highlights. Under entrepreneur, for ability to keep records, if they're neat, accurate, and complete, and all pages are filled out, that student gets an 8 to a 10. If they're somewhat incomplete, unorganized, messy, or has errors, a student would get a 5 to a 7. If they're incomplete, difficult to read, or did not accurately reflect the student's SAE, or more than half the pages that apply to the SAE are not filled out, they would get a 2 to a 4. You take whatever score you give them here, place it there, multiply times 2, that gives you your total that you have to transfer to the front side of the score sheet. For jobs and responsibilities, the student reports all their jobs and responsibilities and it clearly identifies the time they spent on the various jobs and responsibilities. That student gets an 8 to a 10. A student who could somewhat demonstrate through their records of their SAE what their jobs and responsibilities were, or somewhat identified the time they spent on various jobs and responsibilities, would get a 5 to a 7. They had not acquired or could not demonstrate skills through their SAE or jobs and responsibilities, and they could not identify the time or did not identify the time they spent on various jobs and responsibilities, that student would get a 2 to a 4. For scope and growth, and again, remember, scope and growth is different on a placement. It's called hours and earnings on placement, but the student had the highest production ownership or client base of all the SAEs entered in this area, and the student's ownership, production, and client base increased over time. That student would get an 8 to a 10. The student had average production ownership or client base of all the SAEs entered in this area compared to the one with the most and the one with the least. The student would fall into the average category. The student's ownership, production, or client base remained the same over time. That student would also get a 5 to a 7. The question becomes, if a student only has 1 year's worth of books, they would fall into that average category for scope and growth or for hours and earnings because they could not demonstrate growth over time and not fall into the above average category. Below average is the lowest or the least, and their decrease of a client base, production, or ownership. Managerial responsibilities. For above average, it's more than 5 responsibilities and it increased over time. For average, it's 3 to 5 realistic responsibilities and it somewhat increased or stayed the same over time. For below average, they had none to only a 1 or 2 realistic responsibilities, and they decreased over time for below average. Skills learned. 5 skills learned during their SAE in their record book demonstrated within their books. 3 to 5 for average. 1 to 2 for below average. The interview, a very important part of all proficiency judging. Did the student directly answer the questions? Could they completely answer the questions? They demonstrated a clear knowledge. If so, they're above average. If they talked around some questions and couldn't answer all the questions or could not demonstrate partial knowledge of their SAE, they're average and get a 5 to a 7. If they could not provide answers and did not answer them correctly, or they couldn't demonstrate knowledge of their SAE, they would get a below average. Again, these are the same for all areas, except when you get into placement, it switches to hours and earnings. Hours and earnings, earning 260 plus hours or more would be above average. Earning 160 hours more would fall into average, and less than 160 hours would be below average. That very quickly hits the highlights of the SAE rubrics. We encourage you to utilize the section chair or the room host or the chair of the room where you're judging. Please utilize them for questions. Please take time to familiarize yourself with the rubric. Again, thank you for taking the time to serve as a judge. Good luck.